Number 10. Social class. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but the samurai were their very own social class. In the past, and for a very long time, Japanese society was very hierarchical. I think I got that right. Kind of like your high school. You know, you got your jocks, your nerds, your preps, the it girls, the not so it girls, and depending on when you went to high school, a lot of goths. Circa 2003. What feudal Japan lacked in high schoolers wearing black studded trench coats, they made up for in samurai, a warrior class that were above the common folk. Swords for hire, who became so wealthy they formed their own government. But we're still nice enough to let the emperor do his own thing. The shogun is the real boss. I remember that. I'll know that. Number 9. New World. The samurai had ruled over Japan's many feudal kingdoms for close to 1,000 years. Samurai swords and swinging them around and such. However, during the mid-1860s, the world was changing and some folks in Japan were waking up to smell the roses. Japan was in a period of isolation and technology-wise hadn't really advanced as rapidly as European nations. Which if you didn't know, that's not good. This wasn't until an American ship sailed over and the guy from Friends, Matthew Perry, said, "Open this bad boy up, we want to trade." In fear of being an episode labeled the one where we all got obliterated, the Japanese complied. However, they took these new visitors and embraced them, learned as much as they could, and wanted to get rid of their old ways. The Meiji Restoration was the end of the samurai. Number 8. William Adams. This is a story too strange not to be told. During Japan's period of isolation, very few outsiders were allowed to trade or visit. Breaking said rules would result in you not waking up for breakfast. And everyone wants to wake up for that. I love bacon and eggs. Someone invite me over. I love those. However, every once in a while, an English or a Dutch dude would be allowed to stay and chill. One of these lucky dudes was William Adams, who after being an advisor to the shogun, eventually was bestowed the honor of being a samurai. Nice. To be gifted samurai armor, a kick-ass sword, and the honor of being one of them must have felt awesome. One catch though. He had a wife and family back in England. The shogun forbade him from returning. And he never did. On the download though, he did send money back to her when he could. What a gentleman! And speaking of gentlemen, if you like our content here at Bumblebee, then check out our Facebook page to see more. I promise we're funny.
At number 7, Wakashudo. As it turns out, the samurai were surprisingly open-minded about same-sex marriage. However, on the flip side, there was a darker side to their same-sex pairings. Back in the days of the samurai, there was a tradition called Wakashudo, where younger men were required to pair up with older samurai. They would essentially become something of a combination of trainees as well as field wives for an older samurai. In return, the older man would be a mentor to his young companion. He would train him and protect his companion until his apprenticeship was completed, where the young man would then move up in ranks. This sounds like it could have been effective in theory, however the practice of Wakashudo wasn't exactly voluntary. Young warriors were expected to follow in this tradition, and it was believed that if a handsome young man didn't yield to his older lover, then he would be acting shamefully, and this shame would follow him into the next life, resulting him in being disfigured and weak. These young men were being coaxed into this through fear, which is pretty messed up if you ask me. At number 6, ruthless. This next fact about the samurai is certainly one of the most terrifying, so brace yourselves, bumblebees. One of the most messed up traditions of the samurai was something called sushigiri, which when translated means roadside killings, and it's pretty much as straightforward as the name gets. This practice has its roots in honorable duelings, but later became much darker and evolved into a practice where samurai would sneak around to unexpectedly slash at passing merchants and peasants. What makes this a little more sick and twisted is the excuses that some samurai would give in order to justify their actions. Some would claim that they were simply looking to test their weapon, or they were practicing a new strike, while others would claim that they just felt like attacking someone. Talk about messed up, right? To make things even darker though, there was even a legend floating around at the time that claimed that 1,000 sushigiri killings could cure an illness. Sushigiri became such a prevalent issue that it became banned in 1602, but even then it didn't just stop overnight and instead just fizzled out over time, meaning that peasants and merchants were never truly safe from these samurai sneak attacks. At number 5, wives. Now, after learning what we have so far, you can come to understand that the life of a samurai wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows, right? Well, I'm about to tell you about people in the lives of samurai who arguably had it worse than the warriors. Being married to a samurai meant that there was a lot of honor to uphold, and that was a lot of pressure. As a result, there was an act that was performed by the wives of the samurai to uphold their honor of their husband and their family. Some of you may be familiar with the practice of seppuku, and if not, we will get into that in a moment, but essentially it was a method of taking your life in an honorable way. This practice was reserved for the samurai, but their wives had their own variation called jigai. This practice was focused on swiftness and dignity and would be performed for a number of reasons, from anointing from her family's shame to preserving her honor in the event of an enemy invasion. But most commonly though, jigai was performed by wives whose husbands performed seppuku, as samurai wives felt it necessary to end her life if her husband had done the same. The women would tie their knees together as to not be discovered in a compromising position, then she would slit her throat and end her life. At number 4, last stand. As we are no doubt familiar, in life all things must end, and such is the same with the samurai. Though they were the noble warriors of Japan for many dynasties, eventually things had to change. Towards the end of the 1800s, Japan was looking to enter more modern times, and with that they were disbanding the samurai clans. By 1877, only one clan remained, and they refused to go down without a fight, and a fight is exactly what they got. On September 25th, 1877, the government sent in 30,000 soldiers to fight the last samurai clan, but with only 500 men and limited supplies, they didn't really stand much of a chance. They knew that this would be their final battle, and so the night before the battle, they had one last sake party, and in the morning they stormed into battle. 3 hours into the fight, only 40 men were left alive. The samurai leader had been fatally wounded, and not too long after that, the remaining fighters were overtaken by the opposing force, thus ending the last samurai clan.
Number 3, live by the code. The Bushido Code, the honor, the life of a samurai, it's defined by it. Yes, one can argue that without his armor, sword, or bow, he isn't a samurai, but the code comes first. It literally translates to warrior's way. Perhaps something the Mandalorians took from the samurai. Or Star Wars references there, interesting. It's a code of morals, ethics that the samurai lived by. It's something you may find still in use today, actually. I don't have to tell you that Japan is a place with great cultural importance and spirituality. So that's why even today, there are some who still practice or live by Bushido, just with less swords and stuff like that. But it's still pretty cool they practice it though. I think that's cool. That's nice. They're in touch. That's what I'd say. They're in touch. They're culturally and spiritually in touch. Number 2, arts and crafts. The life of being a samurai can be tough, so to take the edge off of life and wielding a katana all day long, the samurai class were encouraged to engage in art, paintings, sketches, gardening, tea ceremonies, flower arranging, rock gardens, all the classic ones you can pretty much think of. In case you guys were wondering, I was never good in art class. Certainly nowhere near the samurai level. Although, I can see myself getting into rock gardens. Rocks are cool, dude. I don't know what it is. Guys like rocks. We like rocks, don't we? Chris, you like rocks, right? Yeah, we like rocks. That's how it goes. Everyone likes rocks. Number 1, duels. Just do one. You know what I mean? One of those? Okay. When we think of duels, we think of the Old West. It's what comes to mind, for me at least. And you wouldn't be wrong. Kinda just goes with the genre. However, the Old West may have borrowed this movie trope from somewhere else. The samurais. Yes, the almighty samurai engaged in duels, just with swords, not 6-shooters. Unfortunately, sometimes they weren't just duels, but random attacks. The crossroads, as they were so called, is where a samurai could just unleash his new blade in a single strike against an unknowing target. And a lot of times they were non-military targets. That's wrong. Can't do that. That's bad.
Number 10. Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Born to the Minamoto clan, just as the Heian period was falling apart, Yoshitsune escaped the murder of his father and brothers during the Heiji Rebellion. He'd be placed in the care of monks at Kurama Temple, where he'd learn to use a sword and, more importantly, his mind. Leaving the temple, the stories of Yoshitsune drift between fact and fiction, some works of art depicting him defeating a bandit by the name of Kumasaka at the age of 15. What is held as truth is his friendship with Benkei, a warrior monk who was defeated by Yoshitsune in a friendly duel. The two would then join the Genpei War, Yoshitsune joining his brother Yoritomo, who had become head of the clan. After the war, his brother would become jealous of him, causing Yoshitsune to flee Kyoto until he was cornered and forced to fight Benkei. Supposedly, he was pressured into committing seppuku, though there is some debate on this, as the Ainu, the Japanese long-maligned indigenous peoples, hold a historical account of Yoshitsune escaping to Hokkaido. Number 9. Kunisoki Masahige. Active in the Kamakura period, Kunisoki was known for his contributions to the Kenmu Restoration in 1333. While his origins are generally unclear, it's agreed upon that he was a member of the gentry before his rise to fame. His career was spent mostly in the service of Emperor Go-Daigo in a war to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate with the end goal of returning power to the rule of the emperor. Despite Kunisoki's tactical brilliance, Go-Daigo was kind of stupid, and a tactical error during a crucial battle led to Kunisoki's demise. His famous last words were, "Would that I had 7 lives to give for my country." Fittingly, he currently has 2 wickedly cool statues, one in front of the temple Kashinji and the other in front of the current Japanese Imperial Palace. Number 8. Kondo Isami. A member of the Shinsengumi, Kondo Isami started life as a relatively well-known scholar and exceptional swordsman. He then rose to fame after a gang of thieves broke into his family home, which he supposedly defeated single-handedly. From there, he was trained as a swordsman, but wouldn't see action until the establishment of the Shinsengumi, where he was established as a teacher of swordsmanship and eventually made a full member. From there, he was embroiled in the conflict born from the dissolution of the Tokugawa shogunate, and while the Shinsengumi were disbanded, at that point he managed to retain a similar rank and title. From there, he was essentially forced on the back foot, and in 1868, Kondo was captured and executed under the pretense of having murdered Sakamoto Ryoma.
Number 7. Divine Wind. The Divine Wind is something you might hear about in Japanese culture, or after a night of eating buffalo wings. It's what makes your underwear cry, trust me, I would know. I know mine does. Besides the cultural connection of Divine Wind, there may be a more literal one. During the time of the Mongol expansion, Japan was looking ripe for the taking. In fear of losing, Japan, like other nations that were succumbing to the hordes, they prepared. However, in the invasion, most of the ships never showed up. But why? How could this be? Well, that was because of a typhoon that destroyed most of the Mongol ships coming in, making defending a lot easier. Thus, Japan was saved. The unusual thing, though, is that this was not the first time, but the second time this happened. So people assumed a lot of things, like the Divine Wind was one of those things, and Japan was invincible. I think? Sure. Number 6. A Jedi's Weapon. The similarities between samurai and Jedi are pretty clear. A group of highly spiritual warriors who live by a code and worship the sword that protects them. A group that had become very powerful and perhaps lost its way. The Jedi must be defeated. And what's a Jedi without his lightsaber, right? Or a samurai without his katana? These things just go together. I don't make the rules up, these are just how it goes. The samurai had the katana, a blade so well crafted, sharp, and connected to the warrior. One of the ways to test a sword's potential was to lob off the limbs of prisoners, to punish thieves and test how sharp your sword is at the same time. You gotta love that efficiency. You gotta love that. That's good. Okay. Number 5. Isolation. As previously mentioned, Japan was in isolation, and in the late 1500s, Japan was deciding that it wanted to be a unified country. That meant all the powerful people from all the powerful kingdoms were about to have a disagreement, and by that, I mean they were going to poke each other with some very sharp swords, until the other guy could not poke back. Well, after a lot of sharp poking, there was one dude left. He took power, looked at his country and said, you know what? I like this place. This place is cool, and he locked it down like a bad dance move on the dance floor. No one leaves, no one comes in, and should you break this rule, like I said before, you will get poked at by some more sharp stuff. Number 4. Severed gifts. I love painting images for you guys, so please allow me to paint an image for you. I'm just like Bob Ross. Happy little trees. Happy little trees. It's Christmas morning. You scurry down the stairs in your favorite PJs. Dad's already got a coffee brewing and Mom looks very tired. Probably because she made Christmas happen and Dad just signed the cards, but I digress. That's when you see a good-sized box. Your eyes begin to sparkle with anticipation. You rip open the 80s wrapping paper like a Wolverine rips into a fresh hunt. You open the box And there's the thing you always wanted. Yeah, that's right, the thing you always wanted. Let me know in the comments what it was. I couldn't take a guess. I'm curious, what was your favorite Christmas gift? Samurai like to give nice gifts too though. They loved it, except it weren't Christmas and it weren't exactly nice. Samurai would often take severed heads as trophies or give them out as gifts. Because that's a normal human thing to do. Ugh. Ugh.
Number 3. Toyotomi Hideyoshi. We're getting into the big boys here. Originally beginning his career under Nobunaga, Hideyoshi would avenge his lord and assume authority. Constructing Osaka Castle, Hideyoshi would then engage in a series of campaigns against the Katsui and Ieyasu clans, creating the clan of Toyotomi. From there, he would campaign in an attempt to unify Japan, conquering Nagoroji, Shikoku, Toyama, Kyushu, and Odawara, which ended the Sengoku period. He'd also ban the peasantry from owning weapons to prevent revolts, creating a statue of Buddha from the melted remnants. He would then attempt to campaign against Korea with pretty poor results. One of his more famous acts was the perpetration of the 26 Martyrs, where 26 Christians were arrested and tortured, then crucified in Nagasaki. He'd try to war with Korea again and would achieve some victories, but it would ultimately fail. Hideyoshi passed away in 1598. This would mark the beginning of Tokugawa's prohibition of expansionist attempts until the 19th century. Number 2. Oda Nobunaga. The biggest and baddest of the boys. Oda Nobunaga was born into power, but once his father passed, the clan began to dissolve into a succession crisis. He would wrangle power from his relatives, consolidating the clan in not a moment too soon, as their longtime rival Imagawa was ready to invade. Leading an army of roughly 2,000 men against 25,000, Nobunaga aggressively battled his rivals, gaining allies and territory through frankly genius strategic calls that led the small territory to sudden and crushing victories. He would then lead a campaign to unify Japan, a massive series of wars that began the Sengoku period. His exploits are far too many for just this one point, and in 1882 he would be betrayed by Akechi Mitsuhide, who would then take the life of Nobunaga's son and force Nobunaga to commit seppuku. Number 1. Miyamoto Musashi. Swordsman, philosopher, writer, ronin. These and many more titles are attributed to the famed warrior Miyamoto Musashi, the wandering swordsman whose exploits are detailed in the self-published Book of the Five Rings. The legends and exploits of this man are legendary, from his first duel to his fight with Sasaki Kojiro, and once more, what is fact and what is fiction can be heavily debated. He was also famed for his peculiar style of combat, using one sword in each hand, a katana and a wakizashi, or sometimes a jute, a sword parrying tool. He claimed that his arms could move more naturally that way, but it also just could have been the rule of cool. Musashi's greatest achievement may have simply just been passing away peacefully in his 60s. His fame has long since lasted in media, most famous being the manga series Vagabond.
At number 10, marriages. If there's anything we've learned on this channel after talking about marriages so many times, it's that marriages long ago were rarely for love, and this still goes for the samurai. After the samurai really started to flourish during the Edo period, they became some of the highest ranked people in Japanese society. As we've learned before on this channel, when you are a person of high status, your marriages become more of a political or financial bargain than anything else, and these marriages were usually arranged. This meant that a lot of samurai were involved in arranged marriages so as to boost the statuses of other families. As you can imagine, this rarely went over well with the people who were actually being forced to marry, as many of them would have already fallen in love with other people prior to this arrangement. This unfortunately led to a lot of couples to take their own lives rather than marry other people, which is quite Shakespearean when you come to think about it. It was a messed up system, but when it comes to status, people would do anything to make their families more respected, even at the cost of other people's happiness. At number 9, weapon testing. The katana. Everyone knows it. This was the most famous weapon used by the samurai, and as it was an important weapon, they had to be tested before being put in the hands of Japan's most famous warriors. The elaborate testing that these katanas were put through was called tameshigiri, which translates to test cut in English. This process would have the sword's owner cut through different materials like bamboo, wood, or armor, but there was a darker side to these tests too. The gruesome subsection to tameshigiri testing was called sumonogiri, which translates to the cutting of tied objects. Now, you would think, oh, these tied objects were just things like bamboo tied to a tree or something. But The tied objects were dead bodies. Yeah, katanas were being tested on dead people. The bodies that were normally used for these weapons testing were usually those of dead criminals, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying. It makes you think twice about how these swords got their bloody stamp of approval, especially as sometimes the amount of bodies that the sword cut through would be inscribed on the side of the blade. Creepy. Now before we carry on talking about the messed up things that the samurai did, why not take a moment to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and while you're at it, maybe consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, poverty. When one thinks of a samurai warrior, you don't really think of them as impoverished. I mean, at one point they were seen as members of high society, but there also came a time that the samurai started to see money as, quote, too tainted to mess with, so they made a conscious effort to avoid it. After the Tokugawa shoguns of the Edo period felt having warm clothing and plenty of food would be detrimental to society, the samurai took this to heart and began living lives of poverty. This has been widely believed because people have grown accustomed to believing in the idea of the noble, humble, and honorable samurai, but historians believe that these impoverished samurai could have been influenced by a number of reasons, like their status in society and having things change too quickly for them. Psychological poverty seems to be one of the running theories as to why the samurai started living lives of squalor, because they had grown accustomed to their wealth and power, that their expectations of such rose higher than their actual income.
Number 7. Sakamoto Ryoma. Mastering the sword at a young age, Sakamoto worked as a teacher of kenjutsu until the political situation in Japan took a turn for the worse. Sakamoto joined a number of anti-shogunate forces, and is credited with a number of assassination attempts, some of which did succeed, though he was known as someone who generally believed that the shogun should serve the people. He would later be assassinated by a group of attackers, who slaughtered Sakamoto and his friend Nakaoka Shintaro. The Shinsengumi was accused of the murder, leading to Kondo Asami's execution. A pro-shogun group called Miwari-gumi would confess to the murder 3 years later, but the true assassin was never found. Sakamoto's gained fame as something of a Clint Eastwood-style character in modern fiction ever since. Number 6. Yasuke. While Japan was famed for its isolation, there were many ports in which trade did occur. One of these trades was the slave trade, where Nobunaga happened upon a man who would have been extremely peculiar to his eyes. Yasuke's exact origins are unknown, but as most of the slaves traded in the area were originally from Mozambique, it's generally a solid theory that he'd have come from there, specifically the people of Yao, though others claim that Sudan and Ethiopia could have served as his homeland just as well. Either way, Nobunaga was introduced to Yasuke, originally thinking that his skin must have been painted. Accompanying a missionary, Yasuke learned Japanese and eventually became a retainer of Nobunaga, becoming the warlord's weapon bearer. We'll get more into Nobunaga later, but Yasuke was known to have been with him at the end of the warlord's life. Beyond that, Yasuke's fate is unknown, as the traitor Akechi did not kill him for quoted reasons that are gross and kind of racist, and I will not say because ew. Number 5. Hijikata Toshizo. Back to the Shinsengumi. Hijikata joined the Shinsengumi alongside Kondo, where he rose his way to the title of Vice Commander. He was famed for rooting out corruption within his organization, and his dedication to the role was so great that he refused marriage on the pretense of how dangerous it would be for his wife. Keeping the group in line, they would join the Boshin War. During Kondo's capture, Hijikata would attempt to appeal Kondo's innocence, but was repeatedly denied. Fearing the collapse of the Tokugawa, Hijikata led one final raid to steal the warship Kotetsu, where the swordsmen were repelled by the ship's crew and a Gatling gun. Driven to Hakodate, before the closing of the war, he instructed his page to dedicate a poem of his death. Though my body may decay on the island of Ezo, my spirit guards my lord in the east. He was later killed, shot while riding on horseback. The Shinsengumi surrendered and was disbanded. Number 4. Tomoe Gozen. Another warrior active during the late Heian period, Tomoe was one of Japanese history's few women warriors. She served under Yoshinaka, leading 300 samurai to victory against 200 Taira warriors in 1182. Clashing with Yoritomo, they lost the battle, Yoshinaka sending Tomoe away while claiming that he'd be ashamed to die with a woman. Smooth. From there, accounts and details become muddy. Apparently she just went on a rampage, killing at least 3 major samurai before escaping. One story goes that she was captured and made to wed the soldier Wada Yoshimori, and after his death in 1213, she made her way to a temple and became a monk, living until 91. Other stories claim that she committed seppuku, and more stories yet claim that she took her lord's head, walking into the sea with it to serve him in the afterlife. Any of these could be true, and personally I think the last one is really metal, so that'd be my headcanon.
At number 3, insults. In another installment of dumb reasons the samurai would randomly kill people, let's talk about the practice of killing people who insulted others. These days, if we feel as though we've been insulted by someone, usually a clapback is in order, but back in the days of the samurai, things were a little different and a lot bloodier. The samurai were allowed to practice something called kirisure gomen, which translates to authorization to cut and leave. Essentially, the samurai were given the authority to legally kill someone if they felt like they had been insulted or disrespected. The only fine print to this was that the killing had to happen immediately after they were disrespected, and the victim was a member of the lower class. The initial insult and subsequent retaliation by the samurai also had to have been witnessed by someone else who could back up the samurai's story, but the samurai were allowed to use their own friends and servants as witnesses, which seems a little biased, but then again, we're talking about killing people because your feelings were mildly bruised. The only downside that this posed to the samurai is that if they were found guilty of misusing their authority to practice kirisure gomen, they would be given a severe punishment of beheading and their house would be abolished, meaning that the samurai's son would not be able to inherit the title of samurai after their father's passing. At number 2, seppuku. Now remember I mentioned the practice of seppuku a little while ago? Well, let's talk about it. Seppuku was a ritualistic method of taking your own life where a samurai would slice his stomach open with a small sword. This was seen as an honorable way to die on the battlefield and was established sometime during the 12th century. There were 2 variations on performing seppuku. One was slicing the abdomen vertically and horizontally, then the samurai would just bleed out and die an excruciating and drawn out death. Doesn't really sound too jazzy to me. But the other, and arguably less excruciating way, was for the samurai to perform a horizontal cut across his abdomen, then immediately following that, his comrade would decapitate him, ending his life. Instantly. Still a pretty horrific way to go, but at least it's a lot quicker than the other method, right? Outside of the battlefield though, when a samurai would prepare to take his own life, he would first write a death poem, have a couple shots of sake, and then perform the ritual. And finally, at number 1, for the streets. Now let's get to talking about what I think is probably the most bizarre and messed up thing that the samurai did. During a period of peace, the samurai didn't really have anything to do. I mean, they were warriors, but when there were no battles or wars to fight in, they kinda got bored. Their swords were just sitting there, gathering dust. So what did they do to fight their boredom? Well, they took to the streets, of course. A number of unemployed samurai from the Edo period took to the streets and formed gangs with other high-born youths. One street gang called the Kabukimono were known for being quite flamboyant, wearing strange clothes and using strange slang, and they would roam the streets harassing people and getting into fights with other gangs. The natural enemy of the Kabukimono was the rival gang called Kyokagu, and they were known as vigilantes made up of lower class people who protected the people. The clashes between Kyokagu and Kabukimono caused a lot of bloody gang violence in the Edo period, so even when there was no outside conflicts, there was still bloodshed.